When Vladimir Putin sent a direct order to Ibrahim Traoré, many thought the young African leader would obey without question. But instead, Traoré's reply was so bold, so unexpected, that it stunned Moscow, shocked the West, and left the entire world speechless. The order came quietly, wrapped in the kind of secrecy that carried both weight and danger. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office when a message arrived through Russian envoys, an instruction straight from President Vladimir Putin himself. It was not a suggestion, not a friendly request, but a command: move Burkina Faso's forces in a direction that would serve Moscow's interest. To many around him, it seemed unthinkable to refuse. Russia was a global power, a nation that could send weapons, advisors, and money, or just as easily bring sanctions and isolation. His advisors exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that perhaps compliance was the safest path. But Traoré, young yet hardened by years of struggle, remained silent as the envoy spoke, his eyes fixed on the red and green flag of Burkina Faso, fluttering gently outside his window. In those colors, he saw not weakness, but the blood and hope of his people. The room grew tense as the Russians pressed harder, offering promises of protection, alliances, and resources if he obeyed. They spoke of consequences if he refused, reminding him that small nations had little space to defy great powers. But when they finished, Traoré leaned back in his chair, his voice calm, yet sharp as steel. "Burkina Faso will never move at the command of another nation," he said, his words measured but firm. "We move only for our people, never for Moscow or Washington or Paris." His advisors froze, realizing the magnitude of what he had just declared. Defiance was dangerous, but submission would be betrayal. The Russians left with stony faces, carrying back an answer they had not expected. In that moment, with a few unshaken words, Traoré had stepped into history, not as a follower of orders, but as a leader unafraid to stand alone. News of Traoré's defiance spread like fire through hidden channels long before it reached the public eye. In Moscow, Putin's advisors whispered of arrogance, of a young African leader daring to spit in the face of global power. In Paris and Washington, intelligence officers scrambled, surprised that Traoré would openly reject what many believed was the safest path, choosing a side. Yet in Ouagadougou, the reaction was different. Word of his refusal slipped into markets and tea stalls, carried by voices that could not contain their pride. He told them no. A vendor whispered to her neighbor, her eyes gleaming with disbelief and admiration. Across the city, taxi drivers, students, and soldiers repeated the story with growing excitement, as if the refusal itself was a victory greater than gold. But not everyone celebrated. Some within Traoré's circle worried about retaliation, warning him that Russia had long arms, that their silence would not last. They feared isolation, sanctions, even covert attempts to destabilize the fragile unity he had built. Traoré listened, but remained unshaken, insisting that dignity was worth more than aid that came with chains. At night, he walked through the quiet streets of the capital with only a handful of guards, greeting ordinary people who saw in him a reflection of their own resilience. Meanwhile, international news outlets began to catch the story, spinning headlines that painted him either as reckless or as a revolutionary voice of defiance. The world was beginning to look closely at Ouagadougou, not with the dismissive glance it often gave African capitals, but with the uneasy realization that something larger was unfolding. For the first time, a young leader in Africa had not only stood against the West, but also refused the East. Traoré had chosen only Africa, and that choice rattled every capital watching. The retaliation did not take long to arrive. Within days of Traoré's rejection, Burkina Faso felt the cold grip of silent warfare. Fuel shipments mysteriously stalled at the borders. Banks reported sudden restrictions on international transfers, and whispers of armed groups receiving fresh supplies of weapons began surfacing in the north. It was the kind of pressure designed not to look like an attack, yet its fingerprints were everywhere. His advisors urged him to reconsider, to soften his words and negotiate a middle ground. But Traore stood firm, telling them that bending once would mean bending forever. "If we surrender today, we will never stand tomorrow," he said, his voice echoing across the marble hall where ministers sat with restless eyes. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou grew restless too, but not with fear, with resolve. University students painted murals of African unity, their bold strokes declaring, "No more masters." Farmers in the villages swore to double their harvests in defiance of shortages, and young soldiers in dusty boots volunteered for extra patrols without asking for pay. Yet beneath this rising pride, the shadows thickened. Foreign operatives were spotted moving through border towns, carrying bribes and spreading rumors designed to fracture the unity Traoré had built. In the capital, strange explosions shook the night sky, warnings disguised as accidents. The pressure was mounting, the threats growing clearer. Still, Traoré refused to yield, standing on balconies before cheering crowds, declaring that Africa would not be forced to kneel. His words carried across radios and social media, inspiring chants of defiance not only in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, Niger, and beyond. The great powers had expected silence, but instead, they had awakened a storm. And as the tension thickened, everyone knew the next move would decide whether Traoré's stand became history or tragedy. The world could no longer ignore what was unfolding in Burkina Faso. In New York, diplomats at the United Nations argued fiercely, some branding Traoré a reckless rebel, others calling him the true voice of African independence. In Paris, headlines screamed warnings of chaos, while in Moscow, stern-faced officials accused him of playing a dangerous game that would end in ruin. Yet, outside those polished halls of power, something unexpected was happening. Ordinary people across Africa were rising in his defense. In Nairobi, students held candlelight vigils with banners reading Africa stands with Traoré. In Lagos, traders shut down markets for a day in solidarity, chanting for dignity over dependency. Even in Johannesburg, artists painted giant murals of Traoré's silhouette standing tall against two giant hands, one bearing the Western flag, the other the Russian bear, both reaching to pull him down. But Traoré's refusal had touched something deeper than politics. It had struck the heart of a people long tired of being told they had no choice. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the pressure was unrelenting. International loans were frozen, the currency weakened, and supplies of medicine and fuel grew dangerously thin. Hospitals struggled, and families lined up for hours to buy what little was left. His enemies expected panic, perhaps even revolt, but instead, the people rallied tighter around him, bringing food to soldiers, sharing what little they had, and filling the streets with chants of unity. Still, the tension reached a breaking point when foreign-backed militias staged sudden attacks in the north, testing the strength of Burkina Faso's fragile army. It was no longer just political, it was war in the shadows. The world watched, holding its breath. Traoré had chosen Africa, but now Africa itself would decide whether to rise with him or collapse under the weight of foreign revenge. The breaking point came with fire. Militias stormed villages in the north, expecting easy victories, but instead they found resistance unlike anything they had faced before. Farmers fought alongside. Soldiers, hunters with old rifles stood shoulder to shoulder with trained units, and women carried water and food to the front lines as if the entire nation had become one army. Videos of barefoot children waving flags while shouting, "Africa will never kneel," spread like wildfire, shaking the continent to its core. In Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed the nation from the palace balcony, his uniform dusted from the battlefield he had just returned from. His voice, raw but unbroken, cut through the night. "They thought we would surrender to fear, but we are not afraid. We are Africa's sons and daughters, and today, we choose our own destiny." The crowd below roared, their chants echoing through the capital like thunder. Across the continent, something shifted. Leaders who had remained silent began to speak. Mali and Niger announced military and trade alliances with Burkina Faso, while youth movements in Ghana and Tanzania demanded their governments join. Even in the corridors of power where Traore had once stood alone, his name was now spoken with respect and caution. The great powers, expecting him to bend, suddenly realized the cost of pushing too far. They had not just created an enemy, but a symbol. For the first time in decades, Africa was uniting not under pressure from outside, but through the defiance of one young soldier who had dared to say no. The storm had not destroyed him. It had given birth to something greater. And as dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the chants of millions carried a single truth into the world. Africa had awakened and would never sleep again. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and share to spread the message. Subscribe now to Faso Histories for more powerful stories of Africa's struggle, unity, and hope.